Good afternoon. I'm Faye Phillips. Thank you for joining us. If you have questions or comments for us, please use the chat on your program, the chat function, and we'll get to those questions when we can. Our speakers today are well known. Dr. Laura L. McLemore is head archivist at LSU Shreveport and holds the William B. Weiner Jr. Professorship in Archives and Historic Preservation. She is a certified archivist and has been active in the profession in Texas and Louisiana for many years. She is a recipient of the Society of Southwest Archivists Distinguished Service Award and the Louisiana Archives and Manuscripts Association I. Bruce Turner Distinguished Service Award. Associate Professor and Certified Archivist Mary Linn Wernet is in her 32nd year as Head Archivist and University Records Officer of the Northwestern State University of Louisiana's Hammy G. Henry Research Center. Mary Linn is also a recipient of the Louisiana Archives and Manuscripts Association I. Bruce Turner Distinguished Service Award. Our session today follows up on LHA's History Lost project. The goals of the History Lost initiative are to educate all, including government officials, about the threats to Louisiana's archives and the need to preserve our archives, and to promote models of good and consistent care of parish records. The need to implement actions toward these goals is urgent. In the Statement of Action for Saving Louisiana's Archival Heritage, we acknowledge the financial and political constraints to success. However, the loss of our archival heritage represents a long-time threat to our democratic way of life and institutions. Laura?
As with tackling any problem, the first step is recognizing that you have a problem, right? The second step is harder. It's the follow-through. We've agreed that something needs to be done, but what and how? In the fall of 2018, LHA's Save Our Archives initiative, having received grant funding, held a workshop at ULL. The goals were basic: identify archives in crisis, figure out how to help them, and implement a long-term program to save our archives. This was a good beginning, but it did not attempt to address the point made both by Doug Harrison and Preston Huff at the 2017 launch of the Save Our Archives initiative. Lack of support from government and political leaders, and we are here today to talk about the how. Okay, so why archives? We're going to focus on archives today because they are the documentary record of our state. They are the essential tools of the historian's trade, and they are, as Bishop Desmond Tutu once observed, and as Mary Linn has said, and Faye also, the bulwark of a free society. Mary Linn?
Okay, next slide. Why we are here, the takeaways from this session with regards to advocacy are: identify a key advocacy issue to address. As historians, you are our stakeholders and ambassadors. As archivists, Laura and I want to encourage you to be prepared for the elevator speech and think beyond the speech to identify clear paths for relevant engagement. To do that, we identify key advocacy issues, compile effective background research and support materials, identify and develop strategies to work with potential decision makers, allies, and opponents, and construct a framework to reach our advocacy objective. As Laura and I go through our presentations, we hope you will begin to brainstorm and write in the chat box questions and comments, and even an action plan. Next slide. Advocacy core concepts: awareness, advocacy, and lobbying. When discussing efforts in drawing attention to archives and archives issues, 3 core items describe the actions taken to effect change. Awareness is the most general of the 3. Awareness involves efforts and initiatives to share general information, knowledge about archival collections, the institutions that hold them, and professionals who manage them. Some examples of awareness are presentations, exhibits, and social media postings. The NSU Archives, or CGHRC, does a lot of this. Advocacy is defined as giving a focused, purposeful message to a targeted audience in order to effect a positive change. This function moves beyond the general goals of awareness because it involves working toward an explicit change. Lobbying is defined as conducting activities aimed at influencing public officials, and especially members of legislative bodies, specifically requesting a particular action on legislation. Most institutions have policies about staff involvement in lobbying. Some institutions specifically forbid staff members from involvement in lobbying activities. Although lobbying is limited, if not prohibited, for nonprofits, there is no ban on carefully targeted advocacy relating to federal legislation and comparably state legislation. Next slide. Awareness versus lobbying versus advocacy. Going through the 3 core actions again, awareness is very general and for everyone. The message is to understand or change perception. For instance, exhibits, presentations, and social media can provide an outcome of better knowledge. The NSU's Cammie G. Henry Research Center has and continues to work with many awareness activities. Advocacy is more specific to a targeted audience. The message is to help in a specific way with an outcome of a specific positive change. Again, the CGHRC has worked on more internal advocacy issues. Examples are archival supplies, building a foundation, and convincing NSU of the need of an assistant archivist. Lobbying is very specific, targeted to legislatures. The message is to take a position on a specific legislation with an outcome to support that specific legislation. Next slide. Awareness versus advocacy versus lobbying, briefly explaining net neutrality in New York. Taking an awareness approach, a stakeholder message would take the form of a general message to everyone. For instance, in New York net neutrality argument, New York State Archives took the position net neutrality is important for archives to access historical records. The outcomes took the form of people began to view the consequences of net neutrality or limiting access to information framework to their previous conceptions of it. Taking an advocacy approach, a stakeholder action and message would be a targeted audience. Sign on to a petition specifically supporting the New York Carlucci and Faye proposal with the justification of access to historical records. With regards to neutrality, New York used hashtag #NetNeutralityNewYork on social media posts about the subject. The outcome took the form of people signed on to the petition, and the social media content was shared, and more people and cultural heritage organizations signed the petition. With lobbying, the stakeholders specifically targeted legislatures. Again, in the New York case, contact was made with their senators to vote yes on Senate Bill 4368 and Senate Bill 4746. The outcomes were senators voted in favor of the bills and signed them into law. For New York archives to accomplish their advocacy approach, they gathered facts and data and decided and stuck with a message to deliver and created an action plan. Next slide. So in today's session, we will discuss further the action of fact-finding, data gathering, delivering a clear message, and creating an action plan. Next slide. With fact-finding and data gathering, one needs to know their goal, subject, audience, stakeholders, and supporters. Next slide. Advocacy, fact-finding, and data gathering. What is your goal? As this slide shows, it's all about moving forward or movement. This pushes the idea into action, thinking specifically. A specific need or action targeted to a specific audience with a specific outcomes that will produce specific benefits. Specific quantitative data, specific qualitative data, and specific compelling stories. Next slide. Examples of fact-finding and data gathering. What is your goal can be demonstrated in the Georgia State Archives and others in 2012. In 2012, when Georgia Secretary of State, Brian Kemp, announced that Georgia Archives would be closed to the public, a coalition of organizations was ready to take immediate action. The group circulated information on social media, created an online petition. The coalition then brought a copy of the signed petition to a ceremony of the Georgia Governor Nathan, followed by a rally. More importantly, the coalition developed a goal, convince the Georgia Governor and Assembly, a specific audience, to provide financial and administrative support to Georgia Archives, specific need or action, so it could operate with staffing and resources needed, specific outcomes, to ensure that the records documenting state government and history are readily accessible for use by government and the people of Georgia that will produce a specific benefits. Next slide. The Georgia Coalition formed a campaign to save the Georgia Archives, gathered quantitative data by using Secretary of State budgets, and found that $320,000 were needed to restore the annual appropriations for a viable state archives. They gathered qualitative data on how the archives was key to finding the solution. For instance, from 2000 to 2012, 34 Georgia counties questioned their boundaries and relied on records in the archives to settle the disputes at a very low cost. The one dispute where the state archives did not have the records cost the state $1 million to the taxpayers of those counties. Louisiana also has similar stories of parish boundary disputes where records are spread far and wide and may not even be found at all. With regards to the Tidelands case, here is a pertinent quote from an article from the LHA's 64 parishes site on the Tidelands case. Quote, in 1965, a supplemental decree awarded the federal government $308 million in escrow royalty payments. Louisiana was awarded a paltry $34 million. We were robbed, Grimion said succinctly. At the High Court decision also failed to determine the coastal mark from which to measure the 3 geographical miles Louisiana controlled. Due to coastal erosion, this marking point would make a critical difference, end quote. If we would have had our records in line, we may have been able to been awarded more of those monies in the Tidelands case. Other hip pocket compelling stories from the Georgia's example included companies such as Coca-Cola, Home Depot, Delta Airlines, and UPS. They cited protecting the archives as a matter of importance to those corporate entities. An important point of these compelling stories is, do the stories meet the SPIT test? Specific, personal, informative, and trustworthy. Fact-finding and data gathering. Who are your audience, stakeholders, and supporters. Your audience are the action figures. They can act and move in your goal. Stakeholders have a vested interest. Supporters will support your goal even if they are not directly affected by it. Next slide. Taking the Georgia example further and moving it closer to home, Louisiana, who are our audience in Louisiana? Who needs to be convinced of the importance of archives? Governor, legislative members, Secretary of State, University of Louisiana system, or the Board of Regents? Next slide. Who are our stakeholders, our kindred souls to mobilize? The Louisiana Archives and Manuscript Association, local and regional genealogical societies, clerks of court, State Historical Records Advisory Board, or the SHRAD, Friends of the Louisiana State Archives, local, regional, and specialized historical associations, especially the Louisiana Historical Association. Next slide. Supporters and our allies, other folks to mobilize, educators, K through 12, and professors using primary source material to teach. And while teaching, instilling the need to continue advocacy to the next generation. Academic and avocational researchers and family historians, corporate entities, local government officials, other potential partners and allies, specific legislatures or policymakers, media outlets and personalities or PR firms. Some examples of other examples of advocacy issues that I played a small part in are the Natchez Trace collections that are at University of Texas at Austin, at the Briscoe Center for American History, University of California Bancroft Library, and the Case Western Reserve. And this was an advocacy that we kind of sent out and said, your institutions have our Louisiana records. Please allow them to be, the public have access to these records. And so, and many of these institutions have the money and wherewithal to do that. And many of these institutions have made these become public for Louisianans or people doing history on Louisiana to discover these records in their institutions. The other example that I can think off the top of my head is as an oil and gas and commercial and residential abstractor, I used to listen to countless stories from lawyers and landmen and realtors, invested citizens, about the question of, well, where else do you think I need to go if the record isn't in the courthouse? Laura?
Now that you know who you need to reach, what information do you need to be effective? I often ask my students on the first day of class to write down what they know about the subject of the course. In the process, I learn something about them, and I also learn where I need to begin and where I need to go, or at least how far I'll be able to go. Likewise, to ready an advocacy action plan, start with the low-hanging fruit. What do you know about the subject? What do you know about your cohorts? Key is what matters to them, because that will determine what you need to focus on. How are you going to address that? In other words, what can you do for them? You may have some research to do. Some sources for research on government institutions on the state level are government websites, National Council of State Legislatures, the National Governors Association, organizations for state government offices, for example, the National Association of State Chief Information Officers or the National Association of Secretaries of State. Some sources for research on government institutions on the local level are statewide institutions for local governments, state professional organizations and state chapters of national professional organizations, institutional government affairs liaisons. Some sources for research on issues. There's the Council of State Archivists Advocacy page for details of state level issues, and we'll, in our sources and resources at the end, there is a link to that page. The Society of American Archivists sections, for example, the Preservation section, Local Government Records section, and the Government Records section. The National Council of State Legislatures and National Governors Association, the State Historical Records Advisory Board, and other state archive sites, and in various other states, and some issues that are detailed on Ballotpedia.org, such as net neutrality and freedom of information. Some sources for research on policymakers and political actors are their individual websites, campaign sites with platforms and position statements. Votesmart.org is a good site for bios and voting records in state legislatures. Local media reports. I have found newspapers.com to be well worth the cost if you have local research to do. Once you've gathered all the dirt, you'll need to analyze it to determine where the power you need is. Power mapping is a visual way of doing that to answer these questions. Who has the power? How and for what do they use power? How do unequal power relationships affect the issues at hand? For example, the Secretary of State versus the State Archivist. What kind of power would it take for us to affect change? Just because someone has a lot of power doesn't mean it'll be useful to affect the change we need. So this is an important question. Do we need executive power, political power, financial power, donor power? Note the last two boil down to money, and I guess you could say it all boils down to money at the end of the day. Does it need to be top down, or does someone at the grassroots level wield the greatest power? Okay, I don't know how well everyone can see this, but here's an example of a power map. Note that there are several factors here. At the top is not only what your agenda is, but what your opponent's agenda is. Simply put, an example would be your desire to see a professional archivist appointed state archivist in Louisiana, as opposed to the governor's desire to make a political appointment to reward a donor. Other factors include the level of power and the level of support. The vertical line where you see the 10, 8, 6, and 4 and so on shows reach, your vertical axis. So number 10 would be decisive, decision-making power or influence, their degree. 8 would be active in decision-making. 6, someone who can have major influence. 4, they would be maybe not major influence, but taken into account. And 3, someone you would have to evaluate. Someone might not get much attention. They might get very little attention. And number 2, not on the radar, which means they wouldn't rate very high on your power map. And then the horizontal level of support. In that case, this ranges from people who can have a positive impact to people who could actually do you some damage. So on that scale, plus would equal the solution. So +3 would be someone who could affect a solution long-term, a diehard supporter. And number +2 would be an active supporter. So that would be a medium term, maybe get you through the argument. And +1 would be inclined toward helping you out, but not in it for the long haul. Then on the other side of 0, you would have people who might actually do your cause damage. So -1 would be someone inclined toward short-term support, and -2 would be an active supporter for the middle term, and then -3 would be someone who was diehard long-term. So you would have to evaluate your supporters to see which side of the scale they fall on. Okay. So what would be the ideal combination? Based on the power map, you'd have to evaluate who has the power or influence to affect the decision, what the underlying agenda is for the opposing point of view, and this is very important, to understand the opposing point of view, because you can't, if you're a debater, you know that if you don't understand the opposition's point of view, you are not in a good position to counter that point of view. How can you reach out to those with influence and power to shift the agenda toward your agenda? And we've talked about some of those ways of doing it, but you have to scale it down to the personal level. Okay, so here is another example of power mapping. You reach out to those with influence and power shifting the agenda. And it's a good power mapping model for networking. The problem would be at the center. The innermost circle is institutional. So what institutions? In this one, you have individuals and institutions. And then the outer circle would be who in those institutions have the power. The next step would be to prioritize by circling the people with the most relational lines pointing to them. Then you circle those with the most critical relationships and influence. So here is an example of what that would look like. Crazy, right? Here's an example of this model where the problem at the center is keeping the Georgia State Archives open. In Louisiana, we have a different issue. Specific institutions are named and individuals within those organizations. This model expands to name powerful associates of those individuals. So you can see where they have on this model circled where there are clusters. For example, in that around Senator Carter, and he has a number of contacts there. Okay, let's see. Now that you've analyzed and prioritized those you need to persuade, you'll need to build your argument. When I used to teach argumentation in freshman comp, we talked about 3 appeals. Logos, the appeal to logic; ethos, the appeal to credibility; and pathos, the appeal to feelings or emotions. Pathos is usually what motivates people to act. If you're Donald Trump, it's all you need. Archives and other forms of cultural heritage have a lot of this appeal, this pathos, to nostalgia, to sentimentality, memory, patriotism, and so forth. But the other 2 appeals are important as well. As former SAA President Kathleen Rowe notes, Every advocacy or awareness effort needs a core statement that clearly and succinctly conveys the concept and purpose on which it is based, something that you can repeat over and over again in a conversation, an interview, a presentation. Not that different from a politician with a slogan. The American Library Association asserts that to be effective, the statement should be, as Mary Linn said earlier, specific, personal, informative, trustworthy. That is, it should pass the spit test. So develop a message that's clear, concise, and compelling. Appeal to logos. Has some stories, the more hair-raising the better, to support it. Appeal to pathos. Has quantitative data to support it. What are the numbers? Ethos. Has qualitative data to support it, such as focus groups or surveys. Again, ethos. These all add persuasive power to your argument. And then will your message resonate with your audience? You may want to consider what part of your message meshes with their interests. Are there mitigating concerns, election cycles, budget cycles, and so forth? Right now, for example, might not be the best time to approach the governor who's trying to cobble together a state-level response to COVID-19 and a hurricane simultaneously. As Lee Iacocca once said, timing is everything. Mary Linn?
Before going forward, some of you might have noticed I just placed 2 documents in the chat box to download. The first document is a glossary of terms used, and then the second document is a reading list. So I hope you get the chance to download these 2 items. If not, you can always email us at our institutions. I think Laura has a copy. If not, you can definitely email me at Northwestern State University of Louisiana and Cammie G. Henry Research Center, and I can give you a copy of both the glossary and reading list. As Laura was talking about delivering a message to tell a story. So what is your goal and how to accomplish your goal? What are the key advocacy issues of your goal? As I go through the next few slides, Laura and I invite you to begin to or continue to send comments or questions in the chat box. Whether we get to them or not, they'll be recorded, and I think we can get to them later and look through them. And then we're hoping that we can provide some sort of article from LHA sometime down the road, or some white paper or something with this session. When delivering your advocacy message, some questions to ask: what written materials do you need? What statistics do you need? When doing these statistics, try to keep them to a 1-page fact sheet or 3 to 5 bullet points, keeping the attention of the legislature or a person you're trying to put forth your message. What oral presentations or statements do you need? Make sure your statements are clear and concise, avoiding jargon, that everyone has one voice with a short and relevant, compelling story. Do you need meetings with individuals or groups? With the communication, what are the credentials? Do you need to show your credentials? Do they need to understand where you are coming from before you meet them? What is, or if you decide on social media, where you have a social media team, who is going to be the administrator of that social media? The public media, who's going to be the voice? And if there is a question asked in a public setting, instead of answering the question that you may not be aware of, offer to research the question and then provide an answer later. Next slide. Based on the data you gather and your talking points, what is the best way to deliver your message? Again, we talk about, is it best for written, in person, or PR statements? When you deliver a message, make sure you have the data, anecdotes, scenarios. And if you are a constituent or a stakeholder, let that person know that you too have a vested interest in the goal that you're trying to accomplish. So if you fail the first time, don't give up. Try to do it again. And as we have pointed out, the spit test, personal, informative, and trustworthy. Next slide. Laura and I have hoped that this session has provided you with incentive to develop an action plan after leaving this session to save Louisiana's archives. Using what we discussed in this session, goals, fact-finding, power analysis, talking points, mechanisms for delivering your message. What short-term victories will advance your goal? You can advocate for the importance of your historical archival heritage by incorporating it into your teaching, which is perfectly aligned with advocacy for stewardship of cultural resources in the LHA mission statement. Quote, "It is one thing to tell students that cultural resources are important, but when they actually use them, they come to appreciate how necessary those resources are to their current and future scholarship and for those who plan to teach their teaching." End quote. Next slide. So in conclusion, I want to read a quote from Sonia Johnson, an American feminist, writer, and activist, particularly an outspoken supporter of equal rights amendment, quote, "We must remember that one determined person can make a significant difference and that a small group of determined people can change the course of history." Do you have anything to add, Laura?
Well, just these sources and research. What I was thinking just then was that I was thinking back to the power map, to the supporters who are long-term, middle-term, and short-term, and thinking that we really, as professionals who have a vested interest in our state's history and our state's archives, we really need to be in that first category of long-term supporters and long-term advocates, because in my own experience, organizations that wanted to achieve a goal have failed when their enthusiasm has lagged and their stick-to-itiveness has not been strong enough, and they have not been in it for the long haul. So it's really important to look at this as a long-term project that you keep. Sonia Johnson is a perfect example. You have to keep at it and keep at it and keep at it and keep at it until one day you achieve your goal. And then the other thing that I have to add is just a list of some of the sources we used, and also a few resources that others may use to get information for making your argument to your institution or to your lawmaker or to the Secretary of State or whoever, your clerk of court, whoever you need to tell your story to or to persuade. A lot of what we did with these slides and with this presentation, we got from a session at Society of American Archivists meeting that Mary Linn and I attended last year on advocating for archives in state and local policymaking. And that was part of the Praxis project, and there is a website for the Practice project. There's also a sustainable development toolkit that I recommend you take a look at. The Council of State Archivists has a very good website with a lot of information on it. That link right there goes directly to their pages on advocacy. The Bonner Foundation 8 Themes curriculum I drew on, and especially of interest to teachers, I think, is the Bonner Foundation 8 Themes curriculum, and also this article by Richard Cox and Janet Alcala and Leanne Bowler on archival document packets, a teaching model in advocacy training using the papers of Governor Dick Thornburgh. And that had also a lot of great information in it. The whole article is available on JSTOR. Advocacy and Awareness for Archivists is a recent publication by the Society of American Archivists. It also has a lot of great information in it. And Save Our Archives is the last one. It is the Louisiana Historical Association page for the Save Our Archives initiative. So I encourage everyone to check those out. And I know we have an election coming up, but when things calm down a little bit, that time will be useful for developing our strategy, our plan for advocacy. And beyond that, I want to thank Mary Linn and Faye and James for all their efforts to make this presentation possible, finally. Thank you.
Yes, I agree. Thanks to you, Laura, thanks to Mary Linn, and thanks to James and LHA. Saving Louisiana's archival heritage, we are in that for the long term. And we need to reinvigorate our actions, because 2020 has been a difficult year for projects outside the walls of my office. But as we move forward, I look forward to us reinvigorating our work, because the need has not gone away, and we need to reach out to all of these potential stakeholders and everyone. For everyone who is watching this presentation, we thank you. Please contact Mary Linn and Laura if you need someone asked for a copy of the PowerPoint presentation. I don't know that you can download it from the videos they're making, but I'm sure Laura and Mary Linn will share it with you. And thank you to those who made comments. We appreciate your thoughts and kindness. And you can reach me. I'm easy to find, and I'll be glad to help in any way I can. And I really hope we'll be having some more meetings soon to talk about history lost and what LHA has accomplished and what we hope to accomplish in the future. Any more comments, ladies?
No, thank you.
Oh,
Thank you.
thank
Goodbye.
you. Bye.
Bye.